John Colter first came west as a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. As his companions headed back to civilization, Colter instead chose to stay behind, and in doing so became what many considered to be the first of the mountain men. Working for fur trader Manuel Lisa, John ventured alone into present-day Wyoming in the dead of winter, attempting to make contact with the Crow. In the several hundred-mile trek that followed, Colter would be the first known American to cast eyes on such wonders as the Teton Mountains, Pierre's Hole, and what we now call Yellowstone National Park. He'd also have his fair share of trouble with the indigenous, namely the Blackfeet. During one such encounter, Colter was stripped naked, covered in the bloody entrails of his dead and dismembered partner, and then forced to run for his life as dozens upon dozens of warriors gave chase. But who was John Colter really? What was his early life like? How'd he survive for so long alone in the wilderness? Why'd he keep turning west again and again? How'd he end up escaping those angry Blackfeet? And just what was it that caused him to eventually, at long last, return to the settlements? My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. John Colter was born sometime around the year 1774 in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Maybe. As tends to be the case with many of the historical figures we cover here on the Wild West Extravaganza, there's just not a whole lot known about John's early life. Hell, the man didn't even appear on the historical record until October of 1803 when, in the great state of Kentucky, he officially enlisted with the Corps of Discovery. How long he had been in Kentucky is unknown. According to author Charles G. Clark, in his book The Men of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, Colter may have possibly, in his younger years, served as a ranger under famed frontiersman and future topic Simon Kenton. Following the American Revolution, Kenton did settle in Kentucky, where he became good friends with Daniel Boone. Scouted for William Clark's brother, George Rogers Clark, in various campaigns, as well as serving as a major in General Mad Anthony Wayne's militia during the Northwest Indian War. So yeah, it certainly is possible that John Colter was a ranger under Simon Kenton. And if that's the case, I think there's a good chance he had indeed been residing in Kentucky for some time prior to 1803. Nevertheless, so far as I know, this is all speculation. Like I said, it wasn't until John hooked up with the Corps of Discovery that things began to clear up just a mite. Now I know what you're thinking, what the hell is the Corps of Discovery? And well, that's just fancy talk for the Lewis and Clark expedition. If you're new to this show, I did just complete an entire 6-part series on Lewis and Clark, and if you'd like to learn more, there's a link down below for you to check it out. In short, though, the Corps of Discovery, or the Lewis and Clark expedition, was just an exploration of the newly purchased territory of Louisiana. And for all you longtime listeners, don't worry, this is just going to be a very, very quick overview of the Corps of Discovery. I promise I'll go fast and you'll barely feel a thing. Long story short, back in those days, the United States of America was only comprised of 16 states, essentially just everything east of the Mississippi River. Then in 1803, France sold Louisiana to the United States. All of a sudden, a huge swath of land, over 800,000 square miles of North America's interior, came under United States control. We're talking roughly everything from the Mississippi River west to the Rocky Mountains, and from New Orleans all the way up to what's now the border with Canada, all belonging to France and then, of course, the United States. And in order to find out exactly what they had just bought, President Thomas Jefferson asked Congress to fund an expedition to explore this new territory, and beyond, all the way to the West Coast. Thus, the Corps of Discovery was commissioned, aka the Lewis and Clark expedition. All total, the trip would take more than 2.5 years and cover over 8,000 miles. From St. Louis, Missouri, across the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, all the way west to present-day Oregon, and then back again. Not exactly a Sunday picnic, to say the least. As such, Captains Lewis and Clark would need to choose wisely when it came to the type of men they would recruit. Not just anybody who volunteered was accepted as a member of the expedition. Far from it. First of all, you couldn't be married. And I don't know about you, but that sounds a little ominous. Almost like they didn't expect everybody to make it back home alive. In all actuality, though, I do think this was more of a practical decision. Since the expedition was so epic in nature, I think the captains most likely didn't want anybody to get to missing their wife and kids and try to turn back prematurely. The recruits would also need to be what Lewis described as stout and, quote, capable of bearing bodily fatigue to a considerable degree, end quote. And as it turns out, John Colter fit this description to a T. And icing on the cake, by the time he enlisted, John was already an accomplished woodsman and hunter. An acquaintance would later write that Colter seemed to have been formed of nature, quote, for hardy endurance of fatigue, privations, and perils, and that he wore an open, ingenuous, and pleasing countenance, and his veracity was never questioned among us, end quote. So there you go. Not only was John a capable man in the field, but he was trustworthy to boot. Captains Lewis and Clark likewise held Colter in high esteem, giving him quite a bit of independence and responsibility as the journey progressed. That said, things did get off to a somewhat rocky start. Before the expedition officially set out, they would spend the winter of 1803 and 1804 at a place called Camp du Bois, near present-day Wood River, Illinois. Although the men were kept somewhat busy preparing for the upcoming expedition and just honing their marksmanship, there's only so much drilling and shooting practice you can do, right? And it wasn't long before the rank and file started to get a little bored. And when soldiers get bored, they oftentimes will get to acting out, including our very own John Colter. Not only did he get a little too rambunctious during the New Year's Eve celebration of 1803, but then just a few months later he brushed off the orders of his sergeant, John Ordway, and paid an unsanctioned visit to a nearby off-limits whiskey shop. A couple weeks later, he and Ordway bumped heads again, this time with Colter and fellow expedition member John Shields threatening to flat-out kill the sergeant. As if to emphasize the point, Colter even made a grand show of loading his rifle. Important to note that many of these volunteers, like John, were civilians prior to enlistment. Colter would have been independent to a fault, used to doing things his own way and not worrying about what some damn NCO had to say about him having a sip of whiskey when or where he pleased. Be that as it may, once Colter enlisted, he was under military command. The Corps of Discovery was a military unit, and like it or not, John Ordway was his superior. While such discipline might not be all that important there at Camp du Bois, the chain of command would be critical once the men set off upriver, and a refusal to follow orders could literally be the difference between life and death. That being the case, on March 29, 1804, Captains Lewis and Clark placed Colter and his companion Shields on trial for mutiny, a charge that was punishable by death. Luckily for both men, however, they would be let off the hook and no punishment of any kind was recorded. Only that Colter and Shields asked for forgiveness and promised to do better in the future. The expedition set out from Camp du Bois on May 14, 1804, and linked up with Captain Lewis at St. Charles, Missouri. Then, just a week later, on the 21st of May, they were headed up the river bound for the great unknown. Now, like I just said, I did finish an entire series on this expedition, so I'm not going to rehash it all here today. Link down below if you'd like to check out that series. I will mention a few particulars involving Colter, though. Despite those initial difficulties back there at Camp du Bois, John really did begin to shine as the expedition wound its way up the Missouri. It wasn't long before the captains figured out that Colter was better at making meat than he was pulling an oar, so he soon became one of the expedition's chief hunters, traveling along the shore and bringing down wild game and meeting up with the keel boat further on upriver. And just to give you an idea, in September of 04, when expedition member George Shannon went missing, Colter was one of the men tasked with searching for him. And while he did fail to locate Shannon, Colter was still able to harvest a buffalo, an elk, 3 deer, 1 wolf, 5 turkeys, and a goose, all while he was out looking for Shannon. Hell, he had even gone ahead of the expedition and had a scaffold of jerky waiting on him when they arrived. Kinda makes you wonder how hard he was searching for poor Shannon. But still, clearly as you can see, he was one hell of a hunter. Also, due to his habit of trapsing on ahead, Colter at times was even first contact when it came to the native peoples. One such encounter occurred in September of 1805 when he ran into a small war party of Salish. They were out hunting horse thieves and not in all that great of a mood when Colter showed up. Nonetheless, he remained calm and put the warriors at ease. He even invited them back to the camp so they could speak with the captains. And on it went, man. The entire trip out to the West Coast, Colter just continued to be a valuable member of the Corps of Discovery. And once they were there at Fort Clatsop, in present-day Oregon, he routinely spent days away from camp scrounging up wild game. Hell, the man wasn't even above doing a little fishing. Anything he could do to help keep everybody fed, he was doing it. And you better believe he was learning a whole lot about survival in the process. As far as the Native Americans were concerned, Colter would have grown proficient in sign language, dealing not just with the aforementioned Salish, but also the Hidatsa, the Mandan, the Yankton, the Brule Lakota, the Shoshone, Nez Perce, Walla Walla, Yakima, the Chinook, and the Clatsop. During the return trip back home, when Lewis and Clark split up the expedition into several smaller groups, Colter had accompanied Sergeant Ordway down the Missouri to help dig up supplies. And once they were rejoined by Captain Lewis, Colter resumed his duties as a hunter. At one point, he and his buddy, John Collins, in the span of just 6 days, managed to bag 31 beaver. Yeah, beaver. That's another thing. Although the Corps of Discovery was not on a trapping expedition, it was hard for a guy like John Colter to ignore the fact that they were traveling through prime beaver country. And in those days, there was a lot of money in beaver. Matter of fact, the Lewis and Clark expedition wasn't even over yet before they began meeting prospective fur trappers headed upriver. Per author Stephen Ambrose in Undaunted Courage, these trappers were, quote, the cutting edge of what might be called the fur rush. It couldn't be taken for granted that there would be many others coming close behind them. However much Jefferson might want to reserve the upper Louisiana for displaced Indians from east of the Mississippi, no power on earth and certainly no laws written in Washington could stop the American frontiersmen. They were lured up the Missouri River by a spirit of endurance, by a cockiness and bravado that were not entirely without foundation, by a love of the wilderness, and by greed. Powerful motives in young men that cannot be denied. End quote, and hell yeah, brother. Now, two of these young men in question were the curiously named Forrest Hancock and Joseph Dixon, who, as it turns out, met the Corps of Discovery right about the same time that the expedition had returned to the Mandan villages on the upper Missouri. So, in other words, the Corps of Discovery were practically home at this point. Remember, the traveling was much quicker headed downriver than it was up, and from the Mandan villages, they weren't but 6 weeks away from St. Louis. Still, though, when Hancock and Dixon invited Colter to join them out west, with the promises of furnishing him with traps and sharing in the profits in exchange for his guidance, Colter accepted. Only problem was, John's enlistment with the Corps wouldn't be up for another 2 months. Nevertheless, both of the captains did agree to go ahead and give Colter an early discharge, and on August 20th, 1806, as the Lewis and Clark expedition headed back to civilization, John Colter once more turned his face towards the west. Keep in mind that John had been away from home for over 2 years at this point, and yet, for whatever reason, he chose to remain in the wilderness. I say for whatever reason, but I guess we all know the official reason, to trap for beaver. But you would think that after 2 years, he'd maybe want to enjoy a few comforts of civilization or even visit his family. I have no way of proving this, but something tells me it was more than those beaver pelts that motivated Colter to head back to the high lonesome. That said, like much of his early life, not a whole lot is known of Colter's whereabouts for the remainder of 1806. According to biographer David Marshall, John and his new partners would end up spending that winter among the Crow, possibly in present-day Montana, not far from where Billings now stands. Still others think they might have been with the Crow further south in Clark's Fork Canyon or the Sunlight Basin, both of which are located in what's now Wyoming. Also, at some point, this trio would split up. Not sure if Colter had a falling out with Dixon and Hancock or what the deal was, but he would once again set his sights on St. Louis. And just like the year prior, he'd once again be persuaded to turn back west before arriving at his intended destination. By the way, he got really close this time, all the way to where the Platte River meets the Missouri, just south of Omaha, before bumping into fur trader Manuel Lisa. Apparently, the wily Spaniard had raised a company of some 40-odd men bound for the Yellowstone River, and upon learning of Colter's most recent exploits, Lisa offered him a job right there on the spot. Also didn't hurt none that a few of Colter's old buddies from the Corps of Discovery were there with Lisa as well. Men like George Drewer and John Potts. They too would have been singing Colter's praises. This party ended up building a trading post on the Yellowstone, dubbed Fort Raymond, not far from the mouth of the Bighorn, and that winter they set about trapping beaver. Not John Colter, though. Oh no. He was instead charged with going out alone and making contact with his old friends, the Crow. just to help sort of spread the word about the new trading post and hopefully entice them to bring their pelts in come springtime. So it were that John would travel down the Bighorn River and air quotes discover what would come to be known as Colter's Hell. And I say air quotes because A, the Native Americans discovered it first, obviously, and that goes for all the landmarks I'm going to discuss here shortly. You know, the Yellowstone National Park, the Teton Mountains, Pierre's Hole. I think it goes without saying that the Native Americans were there first, they saw it first, hundreds if not thousands of years before the Europeans ever showed up. And also, B, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong on this, but I believe George Drewer had also passed through the area of Colter's Hell and reported his findings to Manuel Lisa even before John Colter. Double check me on that though. Either way, John's fellow fur trappers named the area after him, and, well, I guess the name stuck. Now, if you're not familiar, Colter's Hell is a thermal area located on the Shoshone River, or the Stinkin' River as it was known back in those days, not far from present-day Cody, Wyoming. Not to be confused with the geysers and thermal areas located in Yellowstone National Park. Just wanted to point that out because a lot of the time, Colter's Hell is mistaken for Yellowstone, even by some early historians. But they are indeed two separate areas. Now from Colter's Hell, John followed the South Fork of the Shoshone River south, just sort of skirting the Absaroka Range, and then cutting west across the divide to Jackson's Hole. John then briefly trekked into Idaho via the Teton Pass, crossed through Pierre's Hole, and then circled back east to Yellowstone Lake. Lot of innuendos that I don't have time to get into this episode. Colter would follow the west side of the lake all the way north to the Lamar River before turning east again and making his way back to the vicinity of Colter's Hell. From there, he would turn north and return to Fort Raymond. I'm not sure how closely you were just following along, and I don't know if you have a map available, but long story short, John Colter had just made a huge circle throughout northwestern Wyoming, crossing what's now Yellowstone National Park and the Bridger Teton National Forest, completely alone in the dead of winter, and so far as I know, on foot. We're talking a minimum something like 500 miles, but in all actuality, I do think it was closer to around 1,000. I don't know how the hell the man did it, walking on snowshoes and carrying nothing but his rifle and whatever supplies he could stuff in a 30-pound pack. Now, speaking of that rifle, you'll never guess what he was carrying. And you'll never guess because nobody knows. That said, it's not like there's all that many options. Back when Colter was a member of the Corps of Discovery, they pretty much only carried two types of long guns with them. The 1795 model Springfields, which were smoothbores, and the Harper's Ferry model 1803. Probably. On the series I just did covering the Lewis and Clark expedition, I did state that they carried the 1803s, but full disclosure, that does seem like it's still up for debate. Here's the deal. We know that Captain Lewis ordered 15 rifles to be specially made just for the expedition, and that he arrived at the Harper's Ferry Armory in early July of 1803 to pick them up. However, the Model 1803s wouldn't be officially rolled out for another 3 months. That being the case, many do speculate that he instead picked up 15 of the readily available 1792 and 1794 contract rifles. There would have been a few hundred of these laying around there at Harper's Ferry, and Lewis would have already been very familiar with their use, likely having carried one while serving in the Army. And then there's option number 3, a modified contract rifle. Some historians speculate that Lewis had the barrels shortened by around 6 inches, had the stocks reduced from full to half, and then had the bore enlarged so that it could fire a 54 caliber ball as opposed to a 49 caliber. From what I understand, if this indeed was the case, then these modified contract rifles would have been very similar to the soon-to-be-developed Model 1803s. Now, just for bonus points, I consulted the great and knowledgeable Garrett Woods from YouTube's 11 Bang Bang. And he pretty much concurred, stating that there is strong evidence for both sides, the 1803s and the contract rifles, but that there was also yet another possibility, that Colter had carried his very own personal rifle along for the expedition, and that he continued to use it as a free trapper in Montana and Wyoming. Remember what I said earlier about John possibly serving with Simon Kenton. Per the aforementioned Mr. Woods, those Rangers were old-time long hunters who utilized the big heavy caliber Pennsylvania rifles. So that being the case, if Colter did carry his own rifle, it was likely to have been a custom job from Lancaster County. And yeah, I did just waste a lot of words, only to say that I don't know what kind of rifle John Colter carried. But it's fun to talk about, right? I also don't know what other type of supplies he would have had during this solo journey. But hey, we can speculate, right? I don't know about you, but I like those little details. For instance, Colter would have for sure been carrying everything else he needed to keep that rifle in working order, right? A shot pouch, gunpowder, wadding, extra rifle flints, maybe a powder horn, a cleaning and repair kit, possibly a few bars of lead so he could cast his own balls, along with a mold. I'm relatively certain Colter would have also been packing at least a few trade items. Just small trinkets and beads, maybe a few brass buttons or trade knives. He'd have had his own knife as well, obviously, in addition to a tomahawk. As far as other tools, I imagine Colter would have at least carried an awl, for repairing clothing and moccasins, a flint and steel for starting a fire, and maybe even a few metal utensils. As far as clothing was concerned, by this point in time, Colter would have been clad mostly in buckskin, save for possibly a hooded capote or capote fashioned out of a wool trade blanket. Not sure if I pronounced that right, capote, but I'll just be honest with you, bro, I cannot be bothered to look it up. My brain is about to melt from looking up the pronunciation of words here lately. For a shelter, in addition to the capote, I think it's very likely that Colter would have had at least one heavy wool blanket, in addition to a large piece of oilcloth. Considering the fact that he was traveling through GD, Wyoming in the wintertime, he probably had more than one blanket, but I don't know. Maybe he had a buffalo robe. If the weather got too rough, he could always toss up a temporary hut or lean-to of the sort that he often slept in while with the Corps of Discovery, or even improvise a small teepee. Also, I gotta think that John waited out at least a few winter storms among the Crow, nice and snug with a lady friend or two. With all that in mind, what interactions Colter did have with the indigenous during this trip, as far as I know, are unclear. I think it's very likely that he made contact with the Crow, possibly even the Shoshone, but once again, I cannot say for sure. How long he spent with the various bands he encountered, if he encountered any at all, and their overall reception also remains unknown. A lot of questions about this journey, okay? A lot of unknowns. But when coupled with his recent trip with Lewis and Clark, I do think it's safe to say that John Colter had traveled through and seen more of the western United States, at this point, than any other American, alive or dead, at least those of European descent. Now, like I said, Colter returned to Fort Raymond, but come spring of 1808, he headed out once more, west along the Yellowstone until he reached a large village of Crow, camped out at the Three Forks. They and some of their allies, the Salish. Not only did Colter tell him about Fort Raymond, but he also convinced both tribes to travel back to the trading post with him. Unfortunately, they wouldn't get far before being attacked by a large contingent of Blackfeet. Now, just an FYI, but Colter never left behind any written accounts of his own. What we know of his various adventures post Lewis and Clark comes mostly from two sources. Another one of Manuel Lisa's employees by the name of Thomas James, and the explorer/naturalist John Bradbury, both of whom spoke with John extensively and later recorded several of his stories. And according to Thomas James, this attack in question, which occurred somewhere on the East Fork of the Gallatin River, pitted some 1,500 Blackfeet against Colter in a combined force of 800 Crow and Salish. During the battle that ensued, Colter would end up taking a ball to his leg and dragging himself to a thicket where he continued to fight. Unable to stand up, John instead fired from concealment until finally the Blackfeet broke off the attack. And for the next few months, Colter would convalesce at Fort Raymond. It was there, in July of 1808, when he witnessed the near death of Manuel Lisa. For whatever reason, Lisa and fur trapper Edward Rose began arguing, and things soon turned physical. Rose quickly got the upper hand on Lisa, and former Corps of Discovery member John Potts attempted to intervene. While Potts was able to save Lisa, he himself ended up getting a pretty serious ass whipping at the hands of Ed Rose. By the time John Potts had recovered from his beating, Colter's leg was feeling on the up and up, so they decided to strike out together and see if they couldn't rustle up a few beaver pelts. They borrowed a couple of horses from Lisa's fort in the late summer of 1808 and headed out west toward the Three Forks, more specifically the Jefferson River, the same area that both of them had passed through with Lewis and Clark 3 years prior. Only this time, instead of the friendly Shoshone or Crow, it was the Blackfeet who were awaiting. And for what it's worth, Colter and Potts knew it, and as such, they did take precautions. The pair would lay low during the day and only set their traps come nightfall. Only time they would emerge from their hidey hole during daylight hours was right at the ass crack of dawn each morning to check the traps. And it was on such a morning when the Blackfeet finally caught up with them. Both Colter and Potts were in their own individual canoes when several hundred warriors appeared on the east bank of the Jefferson, ordering them to come ashore. As I'm sure you can envision, neither one of these fur trappers were all that keen on accepting this invitation. Be that as it may, I guess they figured that escaping was out of the question, and besides, most likely the Blackfeet just had robbery in mind. No need to rile them up any further, right? Sure enough, as soon as Colter came ashore, the Blackfeet grabbed a hold of him and stripped him of all of his belongings, including his clothes. Witnessing this precarious turn of events, and despite Colter's urgings, John Potts refused to leave his canoe, an act of defiance that earned him a Blackfeet musket ball to the hip. In turn, the wounded Potts shouldered his own rifle and shot the nearest warrior deader in hell. Consequently, within a matter of seconds, Potts was absolutely riddled with arrows. But it wasn't over yet. Then, per Thomas James, quote, they, the Blackfeet, dragged Potts' body up onto the bank and, with their hatchets and knives, cut and hacked it all to pieces, and limb from limb. The entrails, heart, lungs, etc. they threw into Colter's face. End quote. Still not satisfied, the warriors argued over what to do with John. Many wanted to kill him right then and there, but in the end, they simply motioned for him to leave. Sounds a little too good to be true, right? Well, as it turns out, it was. As Colter began to walk away and kind of expected an arrow to the back at any moment, the Blackfeet just kept telling him to go faster. A few minutes later, he noticed that many of the younger warriors were tossing aside their blankets and stripping out of their leggings. That's when it finally dawned on Colter that they were planning on making a game out of him. A race, if you will. Winner gets the scalp. As predicted, just as soon as John began to run, that's when he heard the war whoops behind him. And chancing a glance over his shoulder, Colter saw that a whole passel of warriors were indeed giving chase. So he ran, and he kept on running. Just to give you an idea of how hard John was running, after about a couple of miles or so, his nose began gushing blood. Apparently, this is something that happens. I guess if you exert yourself a little too hard, it can cause the capillaries inside of your nose to burst. Chancing yet another look behind him, John realized that he had outran all of the Blackfeet save for one lone warrior, wielding a lance, and this warrior was rapidly gaining ground. Once again, according to John Colter's friend Thomas James, quote, despairing of escape, Colter awaited his pursuer and called to him in the Crow language to save his life. The savage did not seem to hear him, but letting go of his blanket and seizing his spear with both hands, he rushed at Colter, naked and defenseless as he stood before him, and made a desperate lunge to transfix him. Colter seized the spear near the head with his right hand, and exerting his whole strength, aided by the weight of the falling Indian, who had lost his balance in the fury of the onset, he broke off the iron head or blade which remained in his hand, while the savage lay prostrate and disarmed before him. End quote. My, how the turntables do turn. The downed Blackfeet began to beg for his life, but I reckon old John Colter was just plumb out of sympathy. Not looking to waste no more time, he finished the warrior off with that spear tip and resumed his flight. Now, if you'll recall, Colter and Potts were on the Jefferson River when the Blackfeet appeared. And when Colter started to run, he was headed due east, straight for the Madison River. And all total, it was about 5 or 6 miles away, but John made it in record time. Then, after plunging into the river, he took refuge inside a beaver lodge. Now, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, this is not the same as a beaver dam, but from what I've seen, they can appear similar. These lodges oftentimes stick up several feet above the surface of the water and are created by the beaver using sticks, twigs, grass, mud, shit like that. And just like the name sounds, this is where they live when they're not out there doing beaver activities. The lodges have an underwater entrance, which is how Colter was able to get inside, and it's there where he would remain until nightfall. The Blackfeet soon arrived and scoured the area for pretty much the rest of the day, but they never found him. They still got close enough so that Colter could see him through the chinks in the lodge, though. It was his good fortune they didn't think to look inside, or even worse, set the lodge on fire. And by the way, I know this was during the summer, but that water had to have been pretty damn cold. I mean, this is Montana we're talking about. How he stopped from going into hypothermia, I have no idea. That night, Colter carefully emerged from the lodge but remained in the river, swimming downstream for quite a ways before daring to step out onto the bank. Now, I failed to mention this a moment ago, but when he killed that warrior, he did take the blanket. But other than that blanket, John had absolutely nothing. No clothing, no shelter, no rifle, no knife, nothing. And it was a very long walk back to Lisa's fort. That said, Colter was a survivor. It took him a week, but he was able to make it back to Fort Raymond, scalp intact. He was half-starved and damn near unrecognizable, and his feet were a bloody mess, but he was still alive. And if this little adventure sounds familiar, it was dramatized in 1980's The Mountain Men, starring Charlton Heston. And if I'm not mistaken, it also loosely inspired 1965's The Naked Prey. Now, Colter would once again recuperate there at Fort Raymond, but as crazy as this sounds, just a few months later, he headed straight back to the Three Forks, alone, looking to retrieve all those beaver traps that he and Potts had left in the river. I guess he assumed that the Blackfeet would be in their winter camps and he could just slide on in without anybody noticing. Turns out that was not the case, and no sooner had Colter set up camp on the Gallatin when he was fired upon. Story goes that he was in the process of roasting a hunk of buffalo when he heard some rustling coming up behind him, followed by the unmistakable sound of rifles being cocked. Colter took a flying leap over his fire just as the musket sounded, and once more narrowly escaped the Three Forks with his life. Now at this point, it does seem as if Colter was having second thoughts about a career as a fur trapper. And I can't say as I blame him. I mean, hell, the job's hard enough as it is, but you toss in some of the deadliest warriors on Earth actively trying to kill you at every turn, might be time to take up plumbing or carpentry. John ended up heading east, possibly with the idea of returning to the settlements. We don't know for sure, but he would only get as far as the Hidatsa villages in present-day North Dakota. It was there where he met up with Manuel Lisa's partners, Pierre Menard and Andrew Henry. Said they were planning on building a new trading post over on the Three Forks, the very same area where Colter had already twice narrowly escaped death. And yeah, they offered him a job, and once again, crazy as hell, John Colter accepted. They would spend that winter at Fort Raymond, and by the spring of 1810, the construction of Fort Henry was complete. In case you're curious, this was the first Fort Henry, and if I'm not mistaken, it was located at the confluence of the Jefferson and Madison rivers. Wouldn't last long, though. Doesn't take a genius to figure out that the Blackfeet did not want them there. And that being the case, more than a few fur trappers operating out of Fort Henry would end up dead, including former Lewis and Clark member George Drewer. And once again, our very own John Colter had yet another close call. Returned to camp one day to find his two companions slaughtered, and he said to hell with it, stating, quote, "If God will only forgive me this time and let me off, I will leave the country day after tomorrow, and be damned if I ever come back to it again." End quote. True to his word, John Colter was back in St. Louis just a month and a half later. Once in St. Louis, he met with his old captain, William Clark, and helped to fill in a few more blank spots on the map. Colter also tried, and initially failed, to collect payment for his services with the Corps of Discovery. John was due over $500 in wages, but on account of Meriwether Lewis being dead, there wasn't anybody who could pay him. Ended up suing the Lewis estate, and finally receiving a partial payment of $377.60. In the year that followed, Colter would get married to a lady by the name of Sally, and the happy couple settled down in the small village of La Charrette, some 60-odd miles to the west of St. Louis. Now, way back in May of 1804, the Corps of Discovery had passed through La Charrette just 10 days into the expedition. Back then, it was the last white settlement on the Missouri and consisted of just a few French Canadians. And not long thereafter, the legendary Daniel Boone would move his family there as well. Author David Marshall speculates the following, quote, "For 2 years, Boone and Colter lived as neighbors and wandered the same woodlands and creeks. They undoubtedly crossed paths and swapped tales on occasion. Boone would have described the virgin wilderness of Kentucky, Colter the virgin plains and Rockies. Boone could tell of friendships and fights with the Shawnee, Colter a Crow and Blackfeet. How priceless a conversation." End quote. And yeah, I tend to agree. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall and hear those two sharing stories. And who knows, maybe they even did a little trapping together. Daniel Boone was old as hell at this point, but even in his 75th year, he managed to harvest no less than 60 beaver pelts there in the vicinity of La Charette. Now, in July of 1811, John's wife Sally gave birth to a son they named Hiram, but sadly, the boy would never have a chance to really get to know his father. In early March of 1812, just prior to the United States declaring war with Great Britain, Colter enlisted with Nathan Boone's Mounted Rangers, a military unit described by the Missouri Gazette as, quote, perhaps a fine a body of hardy woodsmen as ever took the field, end quote. And it was while serving with the Rangers that the great John Colter finally went under. In early May, they were cornered by an overwhelming force of redcoats, and a wounded Colter began swinging that rifle of his like a club. Witnesses would later state that as the dead British began piling up at his feet, Colter's last words were, quote, King George can suck it. This was followed by a bald eagle screeching overhead and a faint rendition of Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA. And no, that's not true at all, sorry. John Colter did indeed enlist with Boone's Rangers, and he did die, just not in combat. The official cause of his death, believe it or not, was jaundice. To this day, nobody knows the exact date of Colter's demise. Possibly on the 7th of May, 1812, after just a little over 2 months of service, or according to other accounts, he made it all the way to November 22nd of 1813. We also don't know where Colter was buried. There's a story that I find very hard to believe that claims that Colter's wife Sally, unable to afford a funeral, simply left John laying in state there in their cabin indefinitely. She moved in with her brother, and eventually, over time, the cabin simply began to crumble around Colter's corpse. Then, years later, while clearing land, somebody found a few of his remains and buried them on a nearby bluff. There is a gravestone for John at the Colter Miller Cemetery in New Haven, Missouri, where his son was eventually buried, but that gravestone wasn't placed there until I think like the 1980s. And even then, as far as I know, it's just assumed that Colter was buried there. Speaking of stones, a farmer in Titania, Idaho, found a lava rock with the name John Colter carved into it, along with the year 1808. Very cool find, but nobody can agree as to whether or not it's the real deal. Not sure how such a thing could be proven, but yeah, hoax or not, still very cool. And I guess that's about all I've got on the first mountain man, John Colter. Dude would have only been in his late 30s at the time of death, and I do kind of wonder what he'd have gotten up to had he not come down with a case of the jaundice. As it were, both Andrew Henry and Manuel Lisa would continue attempting to break into the fur trade out west, but the real quote-unquote era of the mountain men that we all know and love wouldn't really begin in earnest for another decade following Colter's death. Make no mistake about it, all of the legendary figures like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson, Hugh Glass, James Beckwith, Joseph Walker, Jed Smith, they all walked in John Colter's footsteps. Now, many of them were still toddlers when Colter was facing off with them Blackfeet. Thank you so much for listening. If you're looking for more true tales from the Wild and Woolly West, feel free to head on over to wildwestextra.com and peruse at your leisure. Or is it leisure? Whichever. While you're there, hit that icon that looks like a coffee cup and buy me a coffee. Your support is most definitely welcome. All right, till next time, adios.